Good morning, church family. It's been a really wonderful morning of worship that we've had so far. See, we've got a number of visitors here with us again today. We're really grateful to have you here. Hope that you'll give us a chance to talk to you, get to know you a little bit after worship. If you'll stick around, we'd love to chat with you a little bit. If you're looking for a church family, my family and I have been here for 2.5 years, and we have just been tremendously blessed. And we're at the point now where we've really got some genuine relationships with folks that we've built. And, you know, honestly, a lot of times when I start off a sermon, I begin with some kind of a little joke or something a little bit cute or something catchy to get your attention, something to make you smile and laugh. I'm not going to do that today. Because today, I'm here to talk about failure. I'm going to be honest with you. I've got some failures in my life that keep me up at night. What about you? People I've disappointed, relationships that I've soured, relationships that I've ruined, ones that I've never really repaired like I should. I've got other ambitious projects that I've had over the years that I saw unfinished. I was preaching down in McGee, down in South Arkansas. I had this visionary idea there was an abandoned, decrepit park in town that had been neglected. And I had this grand scheme to restore and rebuild, rejuvenate this park. And I was involved in local nonprofits in town. And I was wheeling and dealing to make a deal on this. And I encountered some opposition. We were offered a job elsewhere. I moved away. We had the chance to go back earlier this year and visit. And I saw that park. And 10 years later, it's just gotten worse since I left it. Perhaps more seriously, I've got other things in my life, things that I've said that I wish that I hadn't, things that I can never take back. Hurtful words, angry words. I've got things that I wish that I had said to people that I can't say it to anymore. What about you? You have any failures like these? When we first moved to Massachusetts, I joined the local softball team in order to make relationships and break down boundaries with people. And my very first game, I tore my PCL in my knee. Couldn't walk hardly for 10 months after that. Well, it took 4 games into the next season upon my recovery to throw my back out. And I quit the team. Quit. Stopped answering texts, stopped going to games, disappointed people. Perhaps I had a good excuse. I don't feel good about it. What about you? When you think of the failures in your life, the things that keep you up at night, the relationships that are ruined, the things you never finished, the things you quit, the things that you said that you wished you hadn't, the things that you haven't said that you wish that you had. How do you feel about them? Well, the good news in all of this morning, brothers and sisters, is that failure isn't the end of the story for those of us who are in Christ Jesus. The good news for me, and I'm glad that it's good news. What about you? And the good news for all of us this morning is this, that God can bring about His glory even through failure. You see, that's what this story is about this morning, this story from Judges chapter 4. If you have your Bible, if you're just joining us this morning, we're preaching through the book of Judges. We're in chapter 4 this morning. We looked at the first 3 judges from Judges chapter 3 last week, Othniel, Ehud, and Shamgar, and today's judge is a little bit different. This, of course, is the story of Deborah and the general who almost wasn't, and that is the failure of Judges chapter 4. And as Cale read for us a minute ago, he called him Barak. I'll be calling him Barak because it just feels a little bit more of what I was taught in Bible class growing up. I suppose that Barak might be more accurate to the original Hebrew, but, well, we're in 21st century Arkansas. Cut me some slack, okay? Talking about Barak, someone who, despite his failure, his resistance to do what God called him to do, you know what? God still accomplished his purposes through him. His failure and his story is found in Judges chapter 4. And see, where we pick up with this story, we pick up once again, as we do at the beginning of every one of these judge stories in the book of Judges, we begin with the consequences of disobedience. That is, the people were saved. There was a judge. He did what he was supposed to do. He saved the people. And then things went off the rails. Perhaps a generation has passed, sometimes two. And then the people forgot the Lord. They forsook the Lord. They squandered the covenant with God, went after foreign pagan idols. And then God, well, hey, he's not going to sit idly by and let his people slip into disobedience. He wants them to wake up. He wants to teach them a lesson, shake them out of their sin. And so, once again, as there is in this repeating pattern that we encounter over and over and over in Judges, there's a pagan foreign king, a wicked king who comes in, subjugates the people, subjects the people to humiliation. This is, of course, the consequences of sin. Israel has to face the consequences for their rebellion against God. They have to deal with the consequences for their failure. God isn't just winking at their sin. Let's take a look at the text, Judges chapter 4, verses 1 through 3. God's word says this, "And the people of Israel again did what was evil in the sight of the Lord after Ehud died. And the Lord sold them into the hand of Jabin, king of Canaan, who reigned in Hazor. The commander of his army was Sisera, who lived in Hashereth Haggayim. Then the people of Israel cried out to the Lord for help, for he had 900 chariots of iron, and he oppressed the people of Israel cruelly for 20 years." You see, the stage is set now for this story of Deborah and Barak and Jael and Sisera. There's a lot of characters, moving pieces in this particular story in Judges 4 and 5 that we're looking at this morning. But the story begins with a common refrain. The people did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. Might have seemed good to their eyes, but in the sight of the Lord, they had done evil. So God did something about it, and now we've got a technological innovation, a layer to the wickedness and to the discipline that God has enacted. This time, Jabin, he's got a technological advancement. That is, Jabin has these iron chariots. 900 iron chariots, a technological advancement for the time. And that is, the people find themselves outmanned and outgunned against this pagan army that, let's face it, they just have more efficient weapons of war than Israel does at this particular point in history. So what do they feel? They feel powerless. Like there's nothing that can be done. It's demoralizing even to feel like there's no way to make up this kind of ground against this kind of an army. And so, of course, now they need to be saved from the consequences of their sin. Now, here's the thing, brothers and sisters. One of the evil one's greatest lies, I think, particularly in our culture right now, but perhaps this is something as old as Judges, is this. The evil one wants us to think that sin really isn't that big of a deal, doesn't he? You see, he wants us to think that we can just wink at it and we can laugh about it and joke about it at the water cooler. Well, I did it once, or I said it once, and I wasn't struck down with lightning from heaven. I guess I can get away with it. Nobody knows. You see, the evil one wants us to think that our sin is no big deal. Brothers and sisters, do not be fooled. Judges shows us over and over again that God takes sin seriously, doesn't he? God doesn't sweep sin under the rug. He doesn't have a laugh about it. You see, sin has to be dealt with one way or the other. Now, the beauty for us as New Testament Christians is God has dealt with sin finally in the person of Jesus Christ. And because of that, it's easy sometimes for us to take that sacrifice for granted, isn't it? That's why we need to read the Old Testament. We're reminded that God takes sin seriously and has to be dealt with. And so his discipline here that's enacted with the iron chariots of Jabin, you see, these chariots then are reflective of God's discipline. It's the flip side, if you will, to his love. And part of that love is sending deliverance from that discipline, because his discipline, the consequences, they're not the end of the story. And that's the good news for all of us here this morning, isn't it? You see, this is a story about consequences, but it's also a story about cowardice. And this leads us in to the next few verses here of Judges chapter 4. Let's keep reading. Judges chapter 4 and verse 4. Now Deborah, the prophetess, the wife of Lapidot, was judging Israel at the time. And she used to sit under the palm of Deborah between Ramah and Bethel in the hill country of Ephraim. And the people of Israel came up to her for judgment. She sent and summoned Barak, the son of Abinoam, from Kadesh Naphtali, and said to him, "Has not the Lord, the God of Israel, commanded you? Go, gather your men at Mount Tabor, taking 10,000 from the people of Naphtali and the people of Zebulun." She says, go, take these 10,000 people. Then verse 7, "I will draw out Sisera, the general of Jabin's army, to meet you by the river Kishon with his chariots and his troops, and I will give him into your hand." Barak said to her, "If you will go with me, I will go. But if you will not go with me, I will not go." And she said, "I will surely go with you. Nevertheless, the road on which you are going will not lead to your glory, for the Lord will sell Sisera into the hand of a woman." Then Deborah arose and went with Barak to Kadesh. And Barak called out Zebulun and Naphtali to Kadesh, and 10,000 men went up at his heels, and Deborah went with him. You see, we find here there's a little bit of an unusual judge on the scene in Judges chapter 4, isn't there? You see, if we were to go down through all the lists of judges, Deborah would stand out for one particular reason, wouldn't she? And that is the fact that she's a she. Now, it's interesting, isn't it, that Deborah is already judging by the time that the story begins, isn't it? Deborah is already on the scene. She's already judging, but she's judging differently than the three who have preceded her and for the many who come afterward. You see, Deborah is not judging in a militaristic capacity. She's not the deliverer judge, slaying and operating in battle and warfare. No, she's sitting and judging under a tree, isn't she? People are coming to her with their issues, and she's helping provide wisdom and fairness to sort them out, much like the judges that we think of in our own particular culture. No, the militaristic side of judging, God has called Barak to do. And judging by the way that Deborah begins her summons to Barak, God's already been calling him, and Barak hasn't been listening. So this time he's called into the principal's office. He goes to Deborah himself, and she says, "Hasn't the Lord commanded you? Get up, go. You've got work to do. God has called you into action." You see, Deborah, the judge, is tasked by God with raising up this general to enact his rescue mission, but the sad, sorry part of the story is Barak doesn't want to do it. Now, who can blame him? After all, there were 900 iron chariots. I want to be honest, I don't want to face 900 iron chariots. Nevertheless, this is what God has called him to do. You know, the ironic thing in all of this is that the name Barak means lightning. Here he is, General Lightning, scared to do what God has told him to do. The story's trying to drive home this point loud and clear, isn't it? And on top of all that, he says, "I'm not going to go unless you, Deborah, go with me." She says, "Okay, but listen, there's going to be consequences for this. You're not going to be remembered favorably at the end of this story, even if you're victorious." Now, there's two women who come up in Judges chapter 4, two women, which is interesting, of course, that the men that we encounter in the story, they're villains or they're failures, but that the two women, both Deborah and Jael, who comes up later in the chapter, they're both the heroines of this particular story. And pivotal in this particular passage is this word, arise. Get up, go. This word comes up over and over and over again in this particular passage, arise. This is the command that God has given to Barak. And it's fitting, I think, for it being back to school time of year, isn't it? Have you already reprogrammed your alarm clocks? Are the backpacks packed? Are we ready? The teens are looking at each other like, uh-oh, I didn't know it was time to go back to school. Well, listen, it's time, and like it or not, it's time to start getting up out of bed in the morning. Of course, the school year is starting. Be praying for our students and our teachers. We're going to do a big back-to-school prayer next week as we pray over our students and our teachers. But for today, I'll share with you one of my favorite back-to-school occasion books, which is I Am Not Going to Get Up Today by Dr. Seuss. When I pulled this one out of my bag and showed Lucy that her book was going to be in the sermon this morning, she said, and I quote, "What?" And so she expressed disappointment upon having to hear this, not getting to hear this sermon, which is, of course, the opposite to many of you, disappointed for having to hear it in the first place. I'm Not Going to Get Up Today by Dr. Seuss. It's funny because it's subversive and it's relatable. Aren't all good children's books a little bit of both? It's relatable in the sense that, well, sometimes we just don't want to get out of bed in the morning. And it doesn't matter how loud the alarm clock is. Well, I'm the chief of sinners in this regard. The alarm clock can be snoozed. It can even be shut off, can't it? Now, it's subversive in the sense that at the end, the kid wins. At the end, the kid gets his way. Of course, it goes something like this. He says, "I'm not going to get up today. Please let me be. Please go away. I am not going to get up today. The alarm can ring. The bells can sing. My bed is warm and the pillow's deep. This is the day I'm going to sleep." He goes on later to say, "You can tickle my feet. You can shake my bed. You can pour cold water on my head, but you're wasting your time, so go away. I am not going to get up today." It sounds like it was written by my grandmother, bless her heart. I mean, she would tell it like it was. And you were not one to change her mind. Well, at the end of the story, he gets his way. He doesn't. Finally, his mom standing at the door, breakfast in hand, marching band outside the window, police officers in the room. She says, "Well, I guess he really means it." And so she gives the egg to the police officer, who doesn't go away empty-handed in this story. Now, the difference, of course, is that in this story, it's God who's trying to get Barak's attention through the prophetess Deborah. She has instructed him, and she says, "Has not the Lord already commanded you? Get up, arise, go." But in this story, did you notice? The one that the text tells us who arises, the end of verse 9, it's Deborah. Then Deborah arose. She takes matters into her own hands. She's the one who arises in order to do what God has called Barak to do. Now she does it by holding his hand and dragging him into the action. You see, whereas Othniel and Ehud last week in Judges chapter 3, they obeyed without question. In fact, the Lord never even has to speak in Judges chapter 3 to Othniel, Ehud, and Shamgar. What we learn is they just obeyed. God called them, and they went. This time, God gives two commands through Deborah the prophetess to no avail. He only then coalesces when he's given a crutch. You see, brothers and sisters, having God on his side wasn't enough. Having 10,000 soldiers on his side wasn't enough. He had to have Deborah too. I wonder, what about us? What about us? What do we need in order for God to get our attention, in order for him to wake us up, to get us out of bed, to go do what he's called us to do, to forgive the person he's been calling us to forgive, to share the gospel with the person he's been calling us to share it with, to step up and serve in the capacity in the church where the Lord has called you and has shown you that there's a need, and you might just be the person to fill it. You see, we, like Barak, are often faithless in our fear, despite the promises of God. But there's more to the story, isn't there? Because let's face it, what Barak was facing was scary. Deborah never tells him to suck it up. It's really not that bad. That's not the point. The assurance that she gives him then is the reason why he's to have courage. And that assurance has to do everything with God. You see, this is what she tells him in verse 2, in verse 7, in verse 9, verse 14, over and over and over. The theme is this, and it's the hand of God. You see, in verse 2, the hand of God comes up here, and it's that the Lord has sold the people into the hand of Jabin, the king of Canaan. See, now they're in Canaan's hand. But listen, in verse 7, God promises through Deborah to give Jabin and his troops into Barak's hand. In verse 9, Deborah says that God is going to give Sisera into the hand of a woman. And then in verse 14, if we were to continue reading, Deborah proclaims that Sisera has been given, once again, this assurance, into the hand of Barak. Before he ever drew a sword, God proclaims that his hand is upon Barak. And even then, that's barely enough to get him into action. You see, finally, at the end of the story in verse 24, Jabin is pressed by the hand of Israel. Finally, he's subdued by the hand of the Lord's army because God was indeed by his side. And this is the reason for the courage that Barak is called to have. You see, this is a story of consequences. It's a story of cowardice. But here's the good news. It's also a story of courage, isn't it? From here, of course, the story goes that Barak finally goes into action. God has delivered on what he's promised to deliver. Of course, no one is left standing in all of Jabin's army, the 10,000 men of Barak's troops that he's summoned, that God has prepared. He's given them to him. They do the job except for one. Sisera escapes. Sisera, the general of this army, of course, he slips away. Eventually, then he is pierced through the temple with a tent peg by Jael. Jael, the wife of someone who had thrown in with Sisera's army. You see, she took the courage. She took matters into her own hands to save the day. Nobody had to tell her to. Nobody had to twist her arm. Nobody had to call her. In fact, it looks like she's put her own life at risk because her husband is on the side of Sisera in this conflict. Nevertheless, she does. It's violent, but she does what is right in the sight of the Lord. We see ultimately, this really isn't a story about Deborah's courage. It's not really about Barak's either. No, there's a third character who just kind of slips in behind the scenes. And when Barak shows up at the end of the story, hey, we're here to find Sisera and save the day, she says, sure, I'll show you where he is. And he's dead in the tent. See, she's the underspoken, underrated heroine of this story. She had the courage to do something quite daring. This shows us, of course, that this was never about the person that we thought it was about. It's not about getting all the glory. It's not about the fame. It's not about being listed in the ranks of the judges for centuries to come. No, this was all about trusting and cooperating, partnering with God. You see, while ultimately Israel is victorious in a roundabout way, the narrative highlights Barak's failure. More than Jael's victory or Deborah's victory or Barak's eventual victory, Israel's victory, the story drives home the point of Barak's failure. It's meant to show us the shame of resisting God's call to action. But the good news in all of this is this, isn't it? That even despite our failures, God can still accomplish his purposes, can't he? Despite Barak's cowardice, partnering with God, God is the one who's doing the heavy lifting. It's as if he's Barak's lead blocker in this regard, isn't he? You see, doubting God's promises results in a loss of honor. But brothers and sisters, remember this, that even in our failures, despite our fears, God can bring about his glory through our willingness to surrender to him and partner with him in his work in the world. Those of you who just went to Honduras, you experienced this. Perhaps you didn't have a lot of medical expertise or perhaps a lot of Spanish knowledge. I think I remember 10 words from my 4 years of Spanish class in high school, and they mostly are just things I can say to make children laugh at this point. I can't converse intelligently, and I suppose some of you were in the same boat as me, but it was never about you, was it? It's always been about God accomplishing his purposes through unlikely vessels. You see, God didn't need Barak, did he? Barak needed God. Barak didn't need Deborah. Barak needed to trust God. I don't know about you, but one of my favorite movies is Rocky, the original, from the 1970s, and it's a perfect, well-crafted call to action kind of movie. The unlikely hero stepping up to the plate and becoming a national hero. In fact, there's even a statue of him in Philadelphia, a fictional character, which I find humorous. But there's a point in the movie before Rocky becomes a superstar where he's just a bum, isn't he? In fact, the movie wants you to know quite clearly what a bum Rocky is. He's never made it big. He's never gonna make it big. In fact, he flirts with the shy girl in the pet store. That's about the most exciting thing happening for him in his life. He's just sweating and trying to make it by, and he's functioning as local muscle for a loan shark, not an exciting existence at all. You see, Rocky isn't even good enough to be called a has-been boxer. He never is intent to make it in the first place. Doing these brutal fights for just a few bucks. Ultimately, we see that everything in his life reminds him that he's nothing but a bum. Until, of course, Apollo Creed, kind of a stand-in, seemingly for a Muhammad Ali type of character. He's fought everyone there is to fight. He's done everything there is to do. He's looking for the next challenge, an interesting story to keep him in the news, and of course, somebody easy to beat. And they find the Italian stallion, Rocky Balboa. So his manager calls him in and he says, Rocky, you've got a chance of a lifetime. This is your big break. You get to contend for the belt. And Rocky, rather than stepping up to the plate and running up the steps and chasing the chickens before all of that, he says no, doesn't he? In fact, and I'll spare you my Sylvester Stallone impression, you're welcome, though I really want to. He says, well, it's just, you see, that I fight in clubs, you know? I'm really a ham and egger. This guy, he's the best. And I wouldn't be such a good fight. Thank you very much. I appreciate it. You see, many times in a hero's journey type of story, the hero first refuses the call to action. Now, here's the thing about Bayrak. Getting back to the Bible, even after he finally steps into action, he's not really the hero of the story, is he? Deborah comes out much more favorably, as does Jael, but ultimately it's God who gives the victory. You see, God uses imperfect people in spite of our fears and failures for his purposes. And the story that began with consequences and cowardice, it eventually culminates in celebration. You see, Judges chapter 4 is interesting in that it's followed by Judges chapter 5. No other story in the book ends this way. There's a song, there's a poem. Judges chapter 5 in its entirety is reminiscent of the Psalms. In fact, it's reflective most closely of the Song of Moses and Miriam from Exodus chapter 15. Following being led across the Red Sea, the people erupt in praise, recounting how God has got them there. You see, it's not so different from what we do in our worship, is it? We culminate every week with praise, don't we? We sing a song to conclude our services. This is a biblical model. And in this story, we learn this, of course, that it's God who gets the glory. God is the one who delivered the people. We recount all that he's done. In fact, there's even a little list in this song of the people who didn't step up, those who had the chance. Wouldn't that be great? The only time that your name is ever mentioned in the Bible is for the thing that you didn't do, right? Yeah, not a very good legacy to leave in this praise song. And yet this song is reflective, like I said, of the Song of Moses and Miriam. So many similar story beats. But the good news for us, brothers and sisters, is that we'll be singing a different song in eternity. You see, whereas the Bible begins with the Song of Moses and Miriam having crossed the Red Sea, and we get something quite similar to it here. Judges chapter 5, verses 1 through 2, they sang, Deborah and Barak sang the song. The leaders that took the land in Israel that the people offered themselves willingly blessed the Lord. This is the song in Judges chapter 5. Well, the good news is that in Revelation 15, we learn this, that we'll be singing a song of praise in eternity. And it's not the song of Deborah and Barak. It's not the song of Moses and Miriam. No, it's the song of Moses and the Lamb. It's the song that declares what God has done for us in Jesus Christ. And this is good news, brothers and sisters. I don't know about you, but I've had a song on my mind as I've been preparing to preach the story of Deborah and Barak this week. And it's the second verse of Mighty to Save. Thinking about what Jesus has done for us and preaching about failure and fear. And I've got my own. What about you? So we sing songs like this. So take me as you find me. All my fears and failures, fill my life again. I give my life to follow everything I believe in. Now I surrender. See, brothers and sisters, we serve a Savior who called, saved, and transformed doubters, as he still does today. Doubts are healed and people are set free. Jesus called a demon-possessed woman and a tax collector who was hated by his neighbors. Jesus calls even his most devoted friend who abandoned him in his hour of need. Jesus doesn't give up on him either. And that's good news for us today. This is Jesus. This morning we bring our faults and failures before him. Do you need to bring a failure before the Lord? Do you have a broken relationship in your life, a sin struggle, something you regret that you just can't seem to give up to God? Do you need to bring your fallenness, your brokenness, and your shame? Well, the good news this morning is that he still loves you, and he can still use you for his purposes, and he wants to partner with you in showing his love to the world. The question is this: are you willing? Will you step up? Will you arise? You can step up right now by stepping forward. It only takes a step as we stand and sing.